This is Somewhere in the Skies with Ryan Sprague.
Welcome to Somewhere in the Skies. I'm your host, Ryan Sprague. Earlier in the run of the podcast, I sat down with author and UFO researcher Peter Robbins to discuss a lecture he was developing about UFOs throughout history and the cultural significance given to said UFOs then and now. It was one of the highest downloaded episodes to date. The lecture went on to receive praise throughout the United States and abroad. Today, Peter and I take a second crack at his lecture series, discussing his latest installment, which centers around the extraordinary life and strange death of the first ever Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal. Peter brings us on a fascinating journey through the life and career of this highly influential figure and his involvement in MJ-12, an alleged secret committee of scientists, military leaders, and government officials formed in 1947 by an executive order by President Harry S. Truman to facilitate recovery and investigation of alien spacecraft. After resigning as Secretary of Defense, James Forrestal had a nervous breakdown and was committed to the Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland, where he was put under psychiatric examination, suffering depression and extreme paranoia. But what exactly was it that Forrestal was so paranoid about? And what string of events led to his mental breakdown? The answers may lay somewhere in the earliest days of the modern UFO era, and information about the UFO topic that would ultimately lead to Forrestal's untimely death. Officially ruled a suicide, there was much cause for questioning, and that is exactly what Peter Robbins has done with this presentation. He will controversially argue that Forrestal possibly had more to do with the UFO issue than first thought, and that his suicide may have not been a suicide at all, but murder. This will be part 1 of Peter's presentation. Part 2 will be released next week. So, without further ado, here's part 1 of the extraordinary life and strange death of James Forrestal. Today, we are going to be going on a history lesson, but one that most people may not know of, and one that is frankly wrought with intrigue, mystery, and quite possibly UFOs. We are going to be talking about the extraordinary life and strange death of James Forrestal. And with me to do so is my mentor. You know him, you love him, Mr. Peter Robbins. Peter, thank you so much for joining us again on Somewhere in the Skies.
Always glad to be on the show with you, Ryan.
You always bring something new. Anytime I ask you to come on, your episodes are always my most highly downloaded. So I thought, what better way to bring something to the public that I personally didn't know about, that many people don't know, and may have a stunning connection to UFOs. And back in New York, you and I, we sat down face to face, and we actually ran through a presentation that you gave. And I wanted to do that again today with you, because this new talk that you've been shaping, revising, it's one I just had to hear, knowing absolutely nothing about our first Secretary of Defense. So before we even get to that, I have to ask, how did you come to discover James Forrestal, and what made you want to sort of craft this lecture around him?
Great question, Ryan. It actually happened 30 years ago, and the impetus was one of the most, important UFO conferences I ever attended. The MUFON International Symposium of 1987, which marked the 40th anniversary of Roswell, Kenneth Arnold, the modern age of UFO sightings, but had an extra cachet because it was held at American University in Washington, D.C., and in attendance in the audience, among other people, was one American senator. The talks, and that was Claiborne Pell of Rhode Island, who was publicly very interested in the subject. But among the talks was one by one of every sane UFO researchers' mentors, Stanton T. Friedman. It was a brilliant investigative talk called The Secret Life of Donald K. Menzel. And without going off on a long tangent, Menzel, who was the head of the very distinguished Harvard astronomy department, Stan established in no uncertain terms and through a lot of hard work and diligence that Menzel had in fact led a double life. He was, for all intents and purposes, as leading an astronomer in the academic community as there was, well-spoken, respected. Again, you're head of a department at Harvard, people listen. Mm-hmm. He also, for decades, had a completely classified life within the national security establishment of this country. Stan proved it beyond any reasonable legal doubt by being the first person allowed into his personal archives by his widow, into his papers at the National Archives through a lot of research, and his papers at Harvard. And it was also that summer, although some of us had gotten copies in the spring, that the whole MJ-12 controversy broke on the UFO public and, to a degree, popular culture and the public at large. James Forrestal, our first Secretary of Defense, his name plays very strongly into MJ-12, as it would in his role as our first Secretary of Defense. And I was so impressed with Stan's talk that I went back to New York resolved that perhaps I should really allow this inspiration, in a sense, to inform my doing a serious research piece on one of these other 11 individuals named in the MJ-12 initial Eisenhower briefing document, which I do take very seriously. Other aspects of MJ-12 I just don't know, and I'm sure there's a lot of specious stuff out there. But I had dinner with my parents shortly after, and after dinner was basically relating these events to my mother, a remarkable woman, and asked her if she had any thoughts on it, and gave her my top three choices at that time. One, Vannevar Bush, one of the most important, significant, powerful, and influential men of the 20th century that most people have never heard of. Sidney Sowers, our first head of the CIA and President Truman's closest intelligence correspondent, national security advisor, that is, and a distinguished World War II admiral, and Forrestal. And my mom said, do Forrestal. I said, that is my leaning to, but why? Why do you say that? She told me the following. Said, you can't imagine the level of despair, mourning, sadness that we all felt in 1949 when we learned that James Forrestal had taken his life. He was so important to the war effort. He was so important to Truman. He was absolutely charismatic. Me and a lot of my girlfriends thought he was extremely handsome. I crush on him, and I thought, well, there's the reason right there. My mom had a crush on James Forrestal. Upon reflection, she said, it was a huge event in the papers and in culture when he passed, and then his name just disappeared forever. And so I began on and off, coming and going from the subject for years. I gave my first actual talk on Forrestal maybe even close to 15 years ago, and have continued to augment the material as my time has allowed and my interest has prevailed. And what this is, as you know, Ryan, is taking the information, a variation of it that I presented in conferences and libraries and the like as a talk on James Forrestal, and put it into the form of something we're not very well versed in, very familiar with, and for good reasons, in UFO research and events that spring from it, which is dramatic readings. These belong to the theater. And one of the things that first brought us together was not just our shared obsession, interest, passion about the subject of UFOs and their implications, the secret keeping, but our love of theater. You studied to be a playwright and an actor. I was fortunate enough to work in New York theater for many years after a long, civilian love of it. Still study acting, although not to be an actor, but because I love working with them, and I find it fascinating watching them gain the skills that they do. And so what we have here is not something for the stage, but not something for the conference hall, really. It could be done in either place. And the thing that your listeners need to visualize is that as this runs, and it's essentially in two parts, it has a break in the middle, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of images that in an ideal situation would be flying by behind me or staying stationary behind me on a rear projection screen on a stage with a dedicated assistant changing the pictures so that I would not have to, or the actor doing the reading would not have to be bothered with that detail. And so with that as backstory, we begin.
Let's do this. Let's do our table read. All right. Imagine we're in a room on the 12th floor in New York City, and we've got our scripts in front of us. We're going to start, my man. We're going to, curtain is up, lights fade in. Let's do this. I would love to run through this talk that you've given, that you're revising, and where we're heading with this seemingly huge endeavor and project that you're working on. So let's do it, man. Where should we begin?
God, we're such nerds, aren't we?
Lights up, my friend.
Okay, I'll begin at the beginning. In the years immediately following World War II, James Vincent Forrestal was one of the most powerful and best-known men in the Western world. From the early 1940s until the spring of 1949, his presence and policies were often the subject of front-page news, and his above and beyond efforts in the service of his country directly contributed to our winning the Allied victory in World War II. How did it come to pass, then, that so few Americans have ever even heard of him? Why is it that almost all references to him and to his life and accomplishments have effectively been written out of our history and collective national consciousness? What was the actual genesis of this cultural amnesia, and how did it coincide with the legitimate UFO-related national security concerns of the Truman White House? The question at hand, however, is did this presidential advisor, wartime Secretary of Navy, creator of our modern Defense Department, and first Secretary of Defense, take his own life, or was it taken from him? If we're to believe the official account, early on the morning of May 22, 1949, the Secretary fell to his death from a 16th-story window at the Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland, where he was being treated for depression. But this account doesn't hold up under careful scrutiny. In building the case, I'll be presenting to you a case of officially sanctioned murder. I've drawn from more than 30 sources, including declassified documents, biography excerpts, period news reports and commentary, memoirs by some of the men who knew Forrestal best, the 240-odd page file compiled by the FBI, and the published version of the Forrestal diaries. James Forrestal's death was predicated by a profound nervous breakdown. There is no question about this sad fact, nor that it was brought on by a combination of factors. I speak here about a complex, driven man who assumed tremendous responsibilities in his public life, this while his private life slowly unwound, then imploded. Over the years I spent researching his life and death, I came to conclude that there was a central factor in his emotional collapse. And setting aside for the moment all of the most serious Cold War considerations, that it had to do with the unimaginable pressure generated by the above top secret responsibilities thrust upon him the day he was sworn in as our first Secretary of Defense. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's begin at the beginning. It's important that you have some sense of who this man was, of the power he wielded in this country throughout the 1940s, and of the events that led up to his death. James Forrestal was born in 1892 in the small town of Matawan, called then, in Dutchess County, New York. The youngest of three brothers, his father is a contractor who is very involved in local Democratic Party politics, his mother a lay teacher at a nearby Catholic school. Young Jim is highly competitive throughout his high school years, and in 1911 is accepted to Dartmouth College. He transfers to Princeton the following year, where he develops a reputation for being aloof, yet friendly. His yearbook refers to him somewhat prophetically as, quote, the man nobody knows. He becomes editor of the Daily Princetonian and trains to become a competitive amateur boxer. When Jim breaks his nose in the ring, he chooses not to have it reset because he thinks it will make him look tougher. It does. Forrestal leaves Princeton just 3 weeks before graduating to join the Wall Street brokerage firm of Clarence Dillon. But with the First World War now raging in Europe, he enlists in the Navy in 1916 and travels to Canada for flight training with the RAF. But the armistice precludes his seeing action, and he returns to the States and to Wall Street in late 1918. In 1923, he becomes a partner at Clarence Dillon and president when Dillon dies in 1926. That same year, he also marries the beautiful but emotionally troubled Josephine Ogden, a writer at Vogue magazine and a former Ziegfeld Follies showgirl. The couple builds their home on Manhattan's exclusive Beekman Place. As the 1920s roar on, James Forrestal's life comes to parallel that of F. Scott Fitzgerald's J. Gadsby, and that is no exaggeration. The Irish kid from upstate New York is now a full-fledged member of New York society and one of the Wall Street elite. His social circle includes Dorothy Parker, Robert Benchley, Harpo Marx, Gary Cooper, among other luminaries. Over the next dozen years, while most Americans are struggling through the Depression, James Forrestal prospers on Wall Street. Banker Ferdinand Eberstadt, a friend and mentor of Forrestal's dating back to their days together at Princeton, and a financial advisor to President Roosevelt. Eberstadt brings his protege's considerable skills to FDR's attention, and the young stockbroker is invited to join the administration's so-called brain trust, or dollar-a-year men, a select group of business leaders who advise the president on economic matters. Forrestal takes this call to public service extremely seriously. Seriously enough that he puts his business life on hold and moves to Washington, where he accepts the token salary of $1 a year to be at the call of the President of the United States. In May 1940, Roosevelt appoints him Undersecretary of Navy, a job which includes overseeing the manufacture and distribution of all supplies for America's pre-war Navy. He is soon directing and overseeing the manufacturing and flow of all the Navy's war needs, a staggering assignment by any standards.
I start also with the assumption that this country, as one of the great powers that has lifted the terrible shadow thrown across the world in the last 5 years, must retain its armed force and its willingness and ability to make swift use of it whenever nations such as Japan, Italy, or Germany get into the hands of either outlaws or maniacs. I assume that the United States Navy will be one of the great elements of that power, and I speak to you as a group of men who will be officers in the naval service. However, I'm constrained to remind you and your older associates of the Navy that while the trained Annapolis graduates are essential to our ability to conduct naval warfare, the support of the nation is essential to the support of the Navy.
But by all accounts, the Undersecretary does a superb job and seems to thrive in the ultra-high-stress wartime atmosphere. When Navy Secretary Frank Knox dies of a heart attack in April 1944, President Roosevelt has Forrestal sworn in as the new Secretary of Navy. It is in 1940 that he begins to keep a diary. Not wanting to trust anything to memory, it becomes his habit to dictate entries to one of his naval secretaries at the end of each workday, often remaining in his office at the Pentagon until midnight. These entries include particulars on those he meets with, the subjects of their conversations, and the content of the meetings he attends. Forrestal will continue to keep this diary until early 1949. No desk jockey or poseur, the new Secretary of Navy repeatedly puts himself in harm's way and is present at or immediately following the battles of Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, the Solomon Islands, the Normandy invasion, and other conflicts. He also becomes the Roosevelt administration's point man in securing and finalizing the so-called Lend-Lease agreements by which the British are advanced millions of tons of badly needed war materiel. He also negotiates the lease for several American bases in England, including one in Suffolk that will bear the name RAF Bentwaters. He serves with distinction throughout the remainder of the war. At this point, I referred to two photographs I dug up in my research, one showing James Forrestal in Berlin, both of them showing him in Berlin in the summer of 1945 on apparently two different junkets. And much to my shock, amazement, and fascination, there is a young Navy commander who had captained a PT boat with him, named John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Additional research for me has convinced me that Kennedy was naval intelligence. Also, he was on this mission possibly in part because of family clout. His father, after all, had been ambassador to England during part of World War II, as an aside. The war now ended. President Truman asks the Army and the Navy to submit plans for a unification of the armed forces. The president favors the Navy's plan and appoints James Forrestal to head up the gargantuan task of dismantling the old War Department and the creation of a new governmental agency to be called the Department of Defense.
James Forrestal, Center, newly appointed Secretary of the U.S. Navy, confers with his assistants. Forrestal, as Undersecretary, played a major role in creating the largest Navy in the world. Now he is given its leadership.
Forrestal sees this job through to completion despite constant, ongoing inter-service rivalries, again proving himself to be someone who can be counted on, even under great pressure and stress. 9 weeks prior to his becoming Secretary of Defense, a private pilot sighting of unidentified flying objects in Washington state becomes national, then international news. The numerous sightings follow are met by official indifference and media ridicule. Then, in late June or early July, something or things crash in the desert in New Mexico, not relatively far from a town named Roswell.
Headline edition, July 8, 1947. The Army Air Forces has announced that a flying disc has been found and is now in the possession of the Army. Army officers say the missile, found sometime last week, has been inspected at Roswell, New Mexico, and sent to Wright Field, Ohio, for further inspection.
The Army airfield attached to Roswell is houses the world's only nuclear strike force. 48 hours later, the flying saucer story is international news. I cite a series of documents here. Then on July 26, the National Security Act is passed by Congress, and the President immediately names Forrestal to be our first Secretary of Defense. The Act's passage also brings into existence, in the same sweep, the National Security Council, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Central Intelligence Agency, and Dr. Vannevar Bush's Research and Development Board. The New York Times praises Forrestal's nomination, saying his appointment, quote, is the best guarantee that could be given that unification of the services will be carried out intelligently and effectively. A chart at this point illustrates the Secretary's unique central role in the new defense establishment and, by extension, the tremendous responsibility about to be placed on his shoulders. On September 17th, Chief Justice Fred Vinson administers the oath of office to the nation's first Secretary of Defense, but the ceremony is very much a last-minute affair. That afternoon, en route by battleship from a state visit to Brazil, President Truman sends a message to Washington instructing that James Forrestal be sworn in immediately. No explanation is given. Shocked by the president's seemingly impulsive decision, former vice president and now presidential candidate Henry Wallace insists, quote, if there is a genuine emergency, the people have a right to an explanation. If there is no emergency, this action rates as the very lowest method of breeding fear, end quote. So, was there an emergency? And if so, what was it? I cite a paper here dated September 19th, the subject of which is examination of unidentified disc-like aircraft near military installations in the state of New Mexico, a preliminary report. This MJ-12 memorandum, while controversial to some, is also dated September 19th and supplies the requisite emergency. It is titled Examination of Unidentified Disc-like Aircraft, etc. But even if this document never existed or proved to be false, air material Material Command's, quote, opinion concerning flying discs does and is, and its provenance is gilt-edged. It is dated only 4 days after Wallace's publicly posed question. The secret memorandum, written by General Nathan M. Twinings, a future Air Force Chief of Staff, discusses the possible origin and behavior of the aerial unknowns and states unequivocally, quote, the phenomena reported is something real and not visionary or fictitious. The new Secretary of Defense arrives at his new offices in the Pentagon that same day. The Majestic 12 Working Group is established the next day by a special classified executive order issued by President Truman. James Forrestal is listed as third of the 12 men named in this group. 2 days later, Secretary Forrestal issues his first official directive, and the United States Air Force is activated. A September 30 news photograph of Forrestal congratulating Dr. Vannevar Bush after the latter has been sworn in as the new chairman of the Research and Development Board shows the secretary looking particularly grim. Less than 4 months later, on January 7, 1948, Kentucky Air National Guard pilot Captain Thomas Mantell is killed when his plane explodes in an uncontrolled ascent as he is closing on a UFO, quote, of tremendous size in the skies near Fort Knox, Kentucky. We can reasonably assume and conclude the Secretary of Defense is kept carefully appraised of the particulars of this and of all other significant UFO sightings and events occurring during his time at the Pentagon. That June, the Soviet arms blockades West Berlin, setting in motion the Berlin airlift and a major Cold War crisis. By mid-October 1948, support for President Truman is at an all-time low. And with the presidential election approaching, victory seems all but assured for the Republican presidential nomination, Thomas E. Dewey, then governor of New York State. Forrestal confides to his friend Bob Lovett, the future Secretary of Defense, that he is deeply concerned that, quote, since Dewey might be elected president, his representatives should be briefed in preparation for the possibility, end quote. This is a very common practice in modern political politics, but it was not back then. The secretary has made a serious miscalculation. His common sense proposal draws the resentment of some administration officials who equate it with disloyalty to the president. Sadly, this belief gains general acceptance among those who have Truman's ear and becomes a sore point for the president, who refuses to see Forrestal for several weeks following his landslide victory. When the secretary and the president next meet in late November, it is for little more than a photo op on the front lawn of Truman's retreat in Key West, Florida. The stress this causes Forrestal we can only imagine. But one thing is a fact. His star has gone into decline at the Truman White House. 2 weeks later, the top-secret, quote, analysis of flying objects is completed by Air Material Command. In February, Forrestal is photographed with General of the Army Eisenhower. Also that month, he joins President Truman for off-the-record White House luncheons on the 8th, the 14th, and the 23rd. By month's end, the Air Force distributes the secret Project Sign report, its most extensive technical assessment of the subject to date. And from that report, after reviewing all of the possible conventional explanations for the aerial unknowns, Project Sign turns its attention to the possibility of quote-unquote spaceships and bluntly notes something that would have had to have been on the Secretary's mind. Quote, if there is an extraterrestrial civilization which can make such objects as are reported, then it is most probable that its development is far in advance of ours. Such a civilization might observe that on Earth we now have atomic bombs and are fast developing rockets. In view of the past history of mankind, they should be alarmed. We should therefore expect at this point above all to behold such visitations. That is an actual quote from a secret Air Force report, the very first one on UFOs, and it's a line that, for me, is paradigm shifting. It's beyond historic. If it had been included in the script of The Day the Earth Stood Still, it would have fit into that great fictional story brilliantly well, off on a tangent. One of the report's closing remarks also must have had particular resonance for James Forrestal as well. Quote, they, the aerial occupants, must have been satisfied long ago that we can't catch them, end quote. With the most advanced, modern, and awesome defense apparatus in the history of mankind at his command, the nation's first Secretary of Defense is unable to affect the situation he'd inherited, even in the most rudimentary manner. To the best of our knowledge, nothing that he authorizes or attempts during his time at Defense alters the UFO situation one iota, and that had to weigh heavily on the Secretary, a man who habitually personalized his successes as well as his failures. Very tragic character flaw. All cabinet members submit their pro forma resignations to the president following his election, and much to his disappointment, Forrestal's resignation is accepted on March 3rd. He and Truman meet a week later to discuss certain provisions of the National Security Act.
Retiring Secretary of Defense James V. Forrestal and his newly appointed successor Louis A. Johnson drop in at the White House. Wartime Secretary of Navy and first American to assume the title of Defense Secretary, Forrestal gets warm thanks from the President.
It is also at this meeting that Forrestal makes the unusual request that the White House personally take possession of his multi-thousand-page diary. Given the amount of classified material it contains, he doesn't feel it should be kept in his home. The filing cabinet is then removed from Forrestal's Pentagon office and secured in the White House itself. The breakdown. On March 28, the day of his retirement, James Forrestal joins Defense Department employees assembled to see Louis K. Johnson sworn in as the new Secretary of Defense. As part of the ceremony in the huge central area within the Pentagon, outdoors, the President presents the retiring Secretary with the Distinguished Service Medal, the highest civilian decoration authorized by Congress. But the recipient, both surprised and moved, reacts in a very unsettling way. "You deserve it, Jim," quote-unquote, says Truman as he pins the medal on the lapel of Forrestal's jacket. He tries to express his gratitude, but all he can say is, "It's beyond my..." Clark Clifford, a young advisor of Forrestal's and a future Attorney General, is in the audience and remembers, quote, "Unable to respond to the President's generous words of praise, Forrestal is led speechless from the room. It was suddenly apparent to everyone that something was terribly wrong," end quote. Following the change of command ceremonies, Air Force Secretary Stuart Symington, who had regularly challenged Forrestal's authority, is overheard telling the now former Defense Secretary, quote, "There is something I would like to talk to you about." While there is no record of what Symington says, the effect on Forrestal is deeply unsettling to those observing, if not traumatic. He is found sometime later, sitting in his now former office, staring at the wall, and repeating to himself the phrase, "You are a loyal fellow. You are a loyal fellow. You are a loyal fellow." Once outside the Pentagon, Forrestal seems bewildered and dazed, and a shocked aide arranges for the nearby chauffeur of the President's chief science advisor, Vannevar Bush, to drive him back to his Georgetown home. Once there, Forrestal calls Ferdinand Eberstadt, who arrives soon after. Eberstadt is taken aback by his old friend's manner and recalled Forrestal telling him that he is a total failure and considering suicide. The Secretary is also convinced that certain persons in the White House had formed a conspiracy to get him, in quotes, and had finally succeeded. At 5 o'clock, Mr. Forrestal phones the office of the FBI director and asks if Hoover is in town. He is not, but the caller is assured that his message will be given to Hoover. Asked if he would like to leave his number, Forrestal responds that he would like Mr. Hoover to call him at home. The writer adds that F spoke quickly and used short, abrupt sentences, end quote. Hoover's writes at the top of the memo informing him of the call, quote, "I returned the call, but he was not in." The FBI begins an immediate investigation into the Forrestal crisis, and a classified report is issued March 31st. It centers around an interview the Bureau conducted with the Secretary's butler. Excerpts from that FBI interview and quoting. The butler tells the investigators that morning, quote, "Mr. F is to step down as Secretary of Defense. He asks if the butler has seen 4 men enter the property near the driveway. He did not. He also overhears the Secretary on the phone asking somebody if his phone might be tapped. The employee also confides these other particulars. That on March 28th, a Navy Department electronics specialist visited the house to find no evidence of tampering or wiretapping. That an FBI employee checked all of the phones and all other house wiring on May 29th and 30th with similar reported results. That Mr. F. had recently become, quote-unquote, overtly suspicious whenever the front door was open. That he was suffering from slight memory lapses and is increasingly restless and unable to sleep. That he has flown to Florida shortly after the change of command ceremony accompanied by 2 friends. When Mr. F. exhibited a last-minute reluctance to make his departure, he reportedly heard one of the friends say to the other, quote, "We have to do something. We can't keep him around here," end quote. And that following his final departure from the Pentagon, the butler came upon Forrestal's last will and testament lying open on his bedroom desk, together with 7 or 8 powerful sleeping pills. The brief report concludes, quote, that Mr. F. has, during the past several days, been suffering from a slight nervous breakdown, and that his suspicions are the result of this condition. The columnist Drew Pearson, who had a long-standing vendetta against the former secretary, makes the following entry in his diary on April 1st, 1949. Quote, "Forrestal seems to be off his beam. While Tom Clark, that's Truman's attorney general, was in Florida last week, Forrestal called him every day worried about something, wouldn't say what." End quote. On April 2nd, Forrestal and Eberstadt fly to Hobe Sound, Florida, where their friend Robert A. Lovett has a home. Lovett, Undersecretary of State at the time and a future Secretary of Defense, as noted, meets Eberstadt and Forrestal at the airfield. When Forrestal steps from the plane, Lovett is shocked by his appearance, but nonetheless tries to joke with him. Quote, "Jim, I hope you brought your golf clubs because the weather here has been just perfect for golf," end quote, to which Forrestal replies, "Bob, they're after me," end quote. Over the next 3 days, James Forrestal attempts to take his life at least twice. Lovett calls it the worst 3 days of his life. At the request of the Navy, Captain George M. Raines flies to Hobe Sound. Raines is chief of neuropsychiatry at the Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland. Dr. Raines learns of the Secretary's suicide attempts from Lovell and Eberstadt, but refuses to see or examine their friend, insisting that he cannot until the family's psychiatrist of record arrives. Dr. Raines has already learned that Forrestal's wife and or his brother Henry have chosen the renowned Dr. William C. Menninger. Regrettably, Dr. Menninger will not be arriving until the following day, and Raines feels duty-bound to wait until the famous clinician is present. Lovett can only lock his guest in a bedroom for the night after cleaning out its medicine cabinet. The following afternoon, the 2 doctors conduct an examination of the patient, then consult. Together, they decide that the best course of action is confinement at the Bethesda Naval Hospital in Maryland. Dr. Menninger, now Forrestal's psychiatrist of record, then flies back to his clinic in the Midwest, and though he continues to be briefed on the Secretary's progress, never sees his patient again. Dr. Raines accompanies Forrestal on the flight from Florida to Maryland. During the drive from the airfield to the hospital, Forrestal has to be restrained to keep him from throwing himself from the moving car. The patient is admitted to the hospital, and once secured in a room on the 16th floor, a 24-hour Marine Guard is put 3-shift on his door. For most of the first month, the patient is kept sedated. For a week, there is no mention of Forrestal's breakdown or hospitalization in the press or on broadcast radio, something that would be almost unimaginable by today's journalistic standards. The New York Times first runs a story on April 8th, the title being, "Forrestal is treated in Naval Hospital for nervous and physical exhaustion." Quote, "Doctors were very much encouraged by the former Defense Secretary's response to care. Close associates of the former Secretary ascribed this condition to physical and mental fatigue and the worries and responsibilities of his office," end quote, and true enough. Several days later, Bethesda naval officials first used the term operational fatigue to describe his condition. April 11th. One of the first people the patient calls when he is allowed phone privileges is Washington's Monsignor Maurice J. Sheehy. Monsignor Sheehy is a highly regarded prelate who is friendly with many Capitol Hill insiders. Forrestal has drifted from the church over the years and now asks the Monsignor to help him return to it. Sheehy, of course, responds in the affirmative and begins to plan for an initial visit to Bethesda. Next day, coverage invokes operational fatigue brought on by overwork. On the 17th of April, the headline is Forrestal Still Gaining. Notes the recovery of James Forrestal from operational fatigue is only a matter of time, a Navy doctor said today. Captain B.W. Hogan, executive officer of Bethesda Naval Hospital, predicted that the former secretary would not suffer any turn for the worse, end quote. On the 23rd of April, the president visits Forrestal, as well as 2 other members of his administration who are hospitalized for routine ailments. While in Bethesda, Forrestal telephones the White House and is insistent that someone be sent over to check for listening devices in the wall of his room. The White House sends Admiral Sidney Sowers, the first Secretary of the National Security Council and a future director of the Central Intelligence Agency. Admiral Sowers is one of the President Truman's closest confidants and advisors, so much so that he regularly joins the president for breakfast and stays on for the morning security briefing. Sowers assures the patient that the room is free of any listening devices. On the 27th, Secretary of Defense Johnson visits Forrestal and reports that his predecessor looks fine and should be discharged in 2 or 3 weeks. That same day, members of the press receive copies of Project Saucer, the Air Force's desensitized general audience version of Project Sign. By May 17th, Forrestal has gained 12 pounds since his confinement for 5 weeks earlier, and visitors and hospital personnel alike, as do his hospital records, all seem in agreement that the patient's condition is improving. Bethesda Naval Hospital records note Forrestal continues in good spirits throughout all of the 20th and the 21st. He shows no signs of depression, was well-dressed, shaved, and in good appetite, end quote. On Friday, May 20th, Henry Forrestal telephones the hospital. He has decided his brother James should complete his recovery in the countryside at the estate of a family friend, and informs hospital administrators that he will be arriving to take custody of his brother on Sunday, May 22nd. Also on Friday, May 20th, Secretary of Navy John Sullivan has an appointment with Monsignor Maurice Sheehy, one made at the Monsignor's insistence. Since receiving Forrestal's phone call, the Monsignor has visited the Bethesda Naval Hospital 6 separate times, and each time has been told that the secretary was unable to see him. Increasingly frustrated, the Monsignor has taken his case directly to the Secretary of Navy, who in turn contacts Bethesda and is given assurances that Sheehy will be able to see the patient in time, but not enough time as it turns out. James Forrestal has 2 days left to live.
This concludes part 1 of the extraordinary life and strange death of James Forrestal. Be sure to tune in next week for part 2, where Peter and I dig deep into the death of Forrestal and the curious questions left behind in the wake of his tragic fate. What did he know? What was he told? And where does this leave us in terms of the way history remembers James Forrestal? I'll see you here next week for part 2. And remember, keep your feet on the ground, but never stop searching somewhere in the skies. Greetings, everyone. Ryan Sprague here, host of Somewhere in the Skies. For over 7 years and more than 400 episodes, the Somewhere in the Skies podcast has always been free to listen to, but it's not free to create. So we offer several ways to help support our efforts and get rewards in return. If you listen to the podcast on Apple, you can click the subscribe button at the top of your Somewhere in the Skies feed to become a premium Apple subscriber. Or you can join our Patreon campaign with several tiers available. Both of these options give you the same benefits and rewards: ad-free episodes, early access to the main show, and bonus episodes and content. Help keep the lights on at the Somewhere in the Skies HQ. and help us continue to grow by becoming a Patreon subscriber at patreon.com/somewhereskies or by clicking the subscribe button at the top of your Apple feed. Thank you for your continued support, and keep looking up. This is part 2 of a 2-part series featuring author, researcher, and my mentor, Peter Robbins. We are covering a recent lecture Peter has developed about the extraordinary life and strange death of James Forrestal, the first Secretary of Defense appointed by Harry S. Truman. In the first part, we covered the incredible life and career of Forrestal. Now, we're going to dig deep into his possible connections with the MJ-12 program and UFOs. Could this have had something to do with Forrestal's untimely death, ruled a suicide? Peter believes this is anything but. And in the next hour, you'll hear why he believes that Forrestal may have in fact been murdered. I think it goes without saying, if you haven't heard part 1, you should probably do so before diving into this episode. And if you have, enjoy part 2. All right, curtain up, and we are back from the intermission to continue this incredible story.
And so we will. Part 2. Official accounts of James Forrestal's death vary slightly, but follow this basic timeline. Early on the morning of Sunday, May 22nd, Staff Psychiatrist Commander R.R. Dean is asleep in the room next to Forrestal's. The Secretary's regular attendant has not shown up that night for his shift, a first, and hospital apprentice R.W. Harrison has been assigned to look in on the VIP patient on the 16th floor. Forrestal appears to be sleeping at 1:30 a.m., but is awake at 1:45 when the apprentice attendant finds him copying a Sophocles poem out of an anthology of poetry edited by, I think at the time, America's Poet Laureate Mark Van Doren. If not, he was after that, when the apprentice attendant finds him copying out the Sophocles poem. Harrison asks if the secretary would like a sleeping pill, but it is declined. Allegedly, at this point, Harrison forgets to lock the secretary's door behind him and reports to Commander Dean's room, or, by another account, to the hospital security station on another floor, where he updates the officer. He checks the room again 5 minutes later to find it empty. A search is immediately begun. A few minutes later, the 7th floor duty nurse reports hearing a loud noise from her window. It is the sound of Forrestal's body hitting the overhang on the 3rd floor roof. Hospital authorities at first surmise that the patient, finding his room unlocked as he experiences a sudden, highly unexpected bout of suicidal depression, stops writing, walks across the hall to the efficiency kitchen, pushes open the unsecured screen window, knots his bathroom sash tightly around his neck, ties the free end to the radiator below the window, then lowers himself out of the window to hang himself, and is killed when the knot at the radiator end of the sash slips its mooring. A first brief report of the tragedy appears on page 1 of the Sunday New York Times late edition. Forrestal killed in 13th story leap, U.S. morning set, nation is shocked. On May 23rd, lead article in the Times, Forrestal's leap laid to depression. Captain Raines laments that, quote, the former Secretary of Defense took his life in a sudden fit of despondency, quote, unquote, extremely common to the severe type of mental depression he suffered. That day, a 5-man Naval Medical Board is convened to investigate the death. It is led by Rear Admiral Morton D. Willicutts, head of the National Naval Medical Center at Bethesda. The canonization of Mr. Forrestal is already in full swing by Tuesday morning, as exemplified by New York Times reporter Hanson Baldwin's impassioned tribute, which begins, quote, the tragedy of Jim Forrestal had its origins in what Freud described as, quote, the great subterranean pool of the subconscious mind, an extremely sensitive, very shy and thoroughly conscientious person who held emotion at arm's length, Mr. Forrestal had built around his inner soul a wall of toughness and reserve that seemed to some to amount to brusqueness. But behind that Irish jaw and broken nose lay a rare intellectual warmth and eagerness for new knowledge, and a heart kindly and selfless, end quote. On May 25th, Josephine Forrestal, who has remained in Paris throughout her husband's confinement, returns to Washington, and without benefit of even a cursory investigation absolves everyone of blame in her husband's death before she even departs the airport. That afternoon, with President Truman delivering the eulogy and 6,000 people in attendance, James Vincent Forrestal is laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors, including a 19-howitzer salute. He was 57 years old. The Naval Medical Board finishes its hearing on May 30th, having seen fit to conclude its investigation after only 7 days. The report is then submitted to Admiral Willicutt's, and for the next 2 weeks, Navy and National Military Establishment press sections, quote, promise to release the report, but do not. July 19th Times reports that, quote, considerable mystery surrounds a delay in releasing the report made by the Special Naval Investigating Board. Naval press officials give the impression that at least a summary of their findings would be made public. On September 23rd, the public first learns about Forrestal's diary and that it is being held at the White House. It is described as filling an entire filing cabinet that includes numerous secret and top-secret classified documents. On October 11th, Navy Secretary Matthews makes public the investigating board's report absolving, quote, all of any blame in Forrestal's death and in no uncertain terms, quote, that the death was not caused in any manner by the intent, fault, negligence, or inefficiency of any person or persons in the naval service or connected therewith. Such language suggests that the Navy is more concerned with protecting itself than in truly pursuing the matter under investigation. The report concludes that 1. The body found on the third-floor ledge was Forrestal's. 2. That he died of injuries sustained in the fall. 3. That his behavior prior to death, quote, was indicative of a mental depression, end quote. And 4. That the treatment and precautions in the conduct of the case were in agreement with accepted psychiatric practice and commensurate with the evident status of the patient at all times, end quote. Considering the investigation's ultra-bland findings, why the need to delay its release for 5 months? The Navy gives no explanation for the delay. Driving home the casualty of war, occupational fatigue rationale by both government and media greatly helps the American public to accept and not question Forrestal's death as a suicide. And there is little call to feel otherwise. The Times editorializes, quote, his tragedy is directly traceable to his overwork on behalf of the country. When it was announced that he was in the hospital with the diagnosis of operational fatigue, it was instantly understood that there was every reason why he should be there, end quote. We are able to establish that this so-called operational fatigue commenced at the specific time James Forrestal was sworn in as Secretary of Defense. His friend, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Arthur Kroc, recalled in his memoirs, quote, from the time of his appointment as Secretary of Defense in 1947, my wife had begun to detect inner disturbances in Forrestal that I had not, end quote. And at the other extreme, in late 1949, columnist Drew Pearson wrote, the Defense Secretary's nervous deterioration dated back over 2 years. Both observations, one from a good friend and the other from an outspoken enemy, support the premise that Forrestal's mental disturbance began at or about the time he was sworn in as Secretary of Defense in September 1947. In 1951, Viking Press publishes the Forrestal Diaries, which runs 581 pages and quickly becomes a national bestseller. The Times characterized it as, quote, a wealth of observations made just prior to and after World War II by a man who, aside from standing at the center of great events, was acknowledged to be an accurate observer of the history of his time. Liner notes from the book tell us, quote, "This book is drawn from the 15 loose-leaf diaries, over 2,800 pages, left in the White House by James Forrestal shortly after his suicide," end quotes. But this presents a serious and real problem. September 23rd, 1949, New York Times has reported that, quote, "the journal fills a whole filing cabinet," end quote. A cubic foot of documents is the equivalent of about 2,000 or so sheets of typing paper. A standard 5-drawer file cabinet, the type used by the Pentagon at the time, could accommodate about 20,000 pages. No one would have questioned the legitimate need to redact or withhold selected entries from such a diary. In fact, it would have been expected. So why state that the complete diary was only 2,800 pages instead of 20,000? My best guess is that the publisher was never informed of the existence of the additional material. Concerning MJ-12, it has not been my intention here to prove or to disprove the authenticity of the numerous documents which the MJ-12 group is alleged to have generated. Just to note that the few documents I've referenced support the known timelines and whereabouts of the individuals in question in all respects. What has become known as the Eisenhower briefing document named our protagonist as MJ-12 Member 3. Even in this brief treatment, Forrestal's actions and directives connect him to no fewer than 5 other members of that working group. Roscoe Hillenkotter, MJ-12 number 1, Dr. Vannevar Bush, number 2, Nathan Twining, number 4, General Hoyt Vandenberg, number 5, and Sidney Sowers, MJ-12 number 8. This is not a smoking gun, but there is smoke, and it's very much worth noting. The so-called Cutler Memorandum, dated July 14, 1954, was located in the National Archives by the distinguished researcher and investigative writer Stanton T. Friedman. Friedman, a retired nuclear physicist, also did considerable research to validate its authenticity.
I've also worked, on the MJ-12 documents, most important classified government documents ever leaked to the public. They tell the story of the establishment by President Truman of a group of 12, an all-star cast of people whose job it was to deal with the recovery of the crash saucer at Roswell. And there were an all-star cast, the first 3 directors of Central Intelligence, the first Secretary of Defense, 6 outstanding scientists. Well, after 11 years and visits then to 15 archives, I've been to 19 now, and I'm convinced the documents are real.
The memo confirms that, quote, an MJ-12 Special Studies Project, end quote, did indeed exist, though the memo does not specify what the group's mandate or purpose was. The September 24th, 1947 memorandum from Truman to Forrestal came attached to the 8-page Eisenhower briefing document. The Truman Library has confirmed that September 24th was the only day during the entire second half of 1947 that the president met privately with only Secretary Forrestal and Dr. Bush. Uncharacteristically, the president's appointment calendar does not note the reason for or subject of their meeting: murder or suicide. Immediately following the tragedy, the New York Times assigned its features reporter, Walter H. Wagoner, to be the paper's lead journalist on the story. Among other things, Wagoner established the following within hours of Forrestal's plunge, and I quote the following. 1. There were indications that Mr. Forrestal might also have tried to hang himself. The sash of his dressing gown was still knotted and wrapped tightly around his neck when he was found, but hospital officials would not speculate as to its purpose. 2. Mr. Forrestal had copied out most of the Sophocles poem from the book on hospital memo paper, but he had apparently been interrupted in his efforts. His copying stopped after he had written night of the word nightingale. Reports from his doctors and hospital authorities had indicated steady progress toward his recovery. It had been accepted that continued treatment would have brought Mr. Forrestal to complete recovery in a matter of months. And 5, the final sentence of May 23rd's lead article in the Times reads, quote, on the windowsill from which Mr. Forrestal jumped were marks suggesting that he might have changed his mind and tried to climb back in the window, end quote. With no additional details provided, what can we deduce from this last chilling line of text? Only one thing as far as I'm concerned. The marks referred to were made by the fingernails of the patient on the 16th floor as he desperately tried to keep from falling to his death. We need to ask ourselves, why would James Forrestal had stopped copying the Sophocles poem mid-word? Did he have a sudden need to use the bathroom? Possibly. But there is something about stopping writing mid-word as opposed to at the end of a sentence or something that needs to be considered. The most common sense explanation is, and I have to agree with the Times reporter here, is that he was interrupted mid-word. As for the theory that he tried to hang himself but out of a 16th floor window, subsequent investigation by the Navy established that his bathrobe sash had never been tied to the radiator or anything else for that matter. If foul play was not involved, this could only have meant that Forrestal himself had removed his bathrobe sash, knotted it tightly around his own neck, then lowered himself out of the window, then changed his mind, then desperately attempted to pull himself back into the building, then lost his grip on the window ledge. I don't see any alternatives to this unlikely scenario. No one can say with certainty what a desperately depressed and suicidally inclined person is capable of doing in a moment of deep despair. Nonetheless, the secretary would have had to have acted in the manner described, or that at least two individuals worked to restrain him while tying that bathrobe sash around his neck, then forced him out of that window. For what it's worth, no mental health professional I've ever spoken with about this alleged official scenario has ever heard of anything of anyone making a suicide attempt like this. The Navy's so-called investigation into Forrestal's death was concluded in only 7 days, and its findings were so cursory and innocuous that it's fair to conclude there is a separate investigative report which remains classified. Why was hospital apprentice R.W. Harrison, who had never had any previous contact with the VIP patient, assigned to monitor him on this particular night? One account has it that the regularly assigned Marine attendant did not appear for his shift that night due to drunkenness. Not only something that had never occurred previously, but he and the patient had developed a particularly close relationship, described as almost father and son-like to son. Then there's the matter of Monsignor Sheehy, the very first person James Forrestal chose to call once he had been granted phone privileges. Given that the former Navy Secretary, a lapsed Catholic, had specifically told Sheehy in his phone call of his desire to return to the church, and by implication to return to the sanctity of the confessional, from the point of view of anyone who considered Forrestal a security risk, Father Sheehy would have been the last person the secretary should have been allowed to speak with. And in 6 attempts to see the patient, the respected Monsignor never got beyond the hospital's reception area. More. On Monday morning, May 23rd, after learning of Forrestal's death, the Monsignor returned to the Bethesda Naval Hospital for a 7th time. Shortly after arriving, a hospital corpsman, or somebody dressed as a hospital corpsman, approached him and in the crowded lobby, then quietly said into his ear, quote, "Father, you know Mr. Forrestal didn't kill himself, don't you?" The corpsman then disappeared into the crowd before the shocked Monsignor was able to react or respond, this by his own account. On May 20th, as we've learned, Henry Forrestal had informed the hospital of his intention to take his brother out of Bethesda on Sunday, May 22nd, to recuperate privately. Following James's death that morning, Henry became convinced that his brother had been murdered, a view he maintained for the rest of his life. And he wasn't alone in that belief. Arnold Rogo's book, James Forrestal, A Study of Personality, Politics, and Policy, is a scholarly and insightful work based in great part on the author's numerous interviews with many who were closest to Forrestal, including Dean Acheson, Clark Clifford, Lewis Johnson, Robert Lovett, Arthur Kroc, Henry Forrestal, Dr. William Menninger, Dr. George Raines, and Harry S. Truman. Rogo, a professor of history at the University of California, was anything but a conspiracist. However, early on in his book, he makes the following statement, quote, Officially, of course, Forrestal committed suicide on May 22, 1949. But among those closest to him, there are even a few who are certain he was murdered, or if not murdered, that his death was very much desired by individuals and groups who in 1949 held great power in the United States, end quote. Aftermath. In September of 1947, James Forrestal assumed the mantle of Secretary of Defense. In so doing, he was charged with being, quote, the principal assistant to the president in all matters relating to national security, end quote. He had been given the authority to establish military policy and programs and held power over all the service branches, effectively making him the second most powerful man in the free world. Yet despite every conceivable effort, investigation, and study, the military forces he commanded remained unable to either confront or gain significant knowledge of the truly anomalous phenomena then best known as unidentified aerial phenomena or flying saucers. So it was that almost 70 years ago, the architect of our modern defense establishment cracked under the strain of combined factors, not the least of which was his first-hand knowledge that the most powerful nation on earth was powerless in the face of a truly unknown threat. As the man charged with the defense of the nation, who was also a man of principle, James Forrestal took full responsibility for this failure, personally as well as professionally, and in the process of doing so, came to see his personal life as a failure as well. It's tempting to imagine that an acute emotional breakdown is marked by internal confusion and clouded thinking, and for some people this is certainly the case. But breakdowns manifest themselves in very different ways, and I think that James Forrestal was all too aware of the hyper-specific circumstances that were the cause of his undoing. He had lived for almost a decade in the heart of that den of ultra-powerful alpha males who oversaw their country's involvement in World War II, then as the head of our Department of Defense, where there was little room for self-delusion. His longtime habit of personalizing his professional successes and failures and defining himself in terms of them ensured that he was at the point of no return. Showing weakness in that world was not forgivable. Real men did not have nervous breakdowns in 1949, least of all to a larger-than-life public figure known for his highly competitive boxing and tennis playing, a presidential advisor, Navy secretary, and overseer of our modern Department of Defense. Even if he technically recovered, the alpha males surrounding the president would never really be able to trust him again. What if he had some sort of relapse? Mightn't he say something to the wrong someone? Someone capable of turning the Western world on its head? His well-documented, self-destructive behavior in those final few days prior to commitment in Bethesda make it clear that he saw the writing on the wall. Like a good Roman soldier about to be captured, Forrestal did attempt to throw himself on his sword, but was prevented from doing so at each turn. However, once the prescribed therapy of the time had been given a chance to produce results, the patient on the 16th floor grew stronger and began to recover his sense of self and his will to live. The doctors assigned to his case were not cleared to know what he knew, anything but, and their commitment was only to restore him to good mental health, period. That ironic turn of events unfortunately sealed his fate and made it necessary for others to complete the job for him. America's collective memory of their fallen hero lingered for a while, though now to be linked forever with the tragedy of his combat fatigue-induced suicide. The implications of such a key player, folding as Cold War realities deepened, were not lost on anyone cleared to know the secrets that he knew. And as the years, then decades, began to pass, so did the public's memory of the man who had been a patient at the Bethesda Naval Facility in the spring of 1949. To that select group of men who held power in this country in the middle of the last century, James Forrestal's mental collapse had to be treated as a priority national security matter. The decision to force him out of that window was, I am convinced, in no way personal. It's even likely that the men involved liked and admired Mr. Forrestal as an individual. His murder was simply the only way to resolve what this inner circle had come to perceive as a security risk of the gravest nature. Despite his dedication, love of country, and tireless contributions to the safety and security of our nation, the name and accomplishments of James Vincent Forrestal have effectively been written out of 20th century history. And this oversight is something that should be corrected, don't you think?
Wow. I don't even know where to begin, Peter. I mean, the tragedy behind this, no matter what you extrapolate, whether it was a suicide or a murder, the tragedy behind that, the idea that this had to occur, his fate was inevitable in terms of whatever he knew. I don't even know. This really brings to mind the idea of, like, what is most important to us. Like you said, these men in power at the time, they had no choice. The information they had could inevitably unravel everything they'd worked for, you know, as Forrestal being the first defense secretary. It's just, I can't imagine the pressure that any of these men went through. And the fact that Forrestal had this breakdown,
yeah,
I would give anything to have been a fly on the wall that day.
Yeah. It is one of the abiding mysteries at the center of the beginning of our national security state, so to say, that warrants more people having a general understanding of it and an appreciation of this decent, hardworking, and very patriotic American. And I use that word very much in the old-fashioned sense and not the way it's often bandied about now. I sometimes cite a dark aphorism that I credit to mafia hitmen before they shoot you in the back of the head twice with the silenced .22 pistol of, it's nothing personal, it's just business. And again, as I continued my research over the years into this, which for me always includes at least an attempt to get behind the eyes of the people who you may see yourself in opposition to, or the bad guys, or the mysterious people, or the ones that are as front and center as possible, and at least have an opportunity to try to put yourself in their place. I like you, I'm conflicted, and what can one say except that this seems to be the way that it happened? And for me, the things that made the telling of this UFO-related story as true and as well-researched as anything I've tackled over the years had two elements within it that so many other UFO-related accounts, cases, to be dispassionate, incidents that you and I have studied in this field. This story has two elements that I would more associate with drama, fiction, and literally, as well as figuratively, Greek tragedy. And those are the obvious reasons that I felt I should tackle this for a reading. Now, you and I talked a bit before the broadcast, both been busy catching up a bit, and I told you that I was satisfied with this for what it is, but that a week or so ago, in just one of those moments that we have in our creative lives, it hit me that it was not what I was after. It's a good piece to have in my repertoire, I think, for if any UFO-specific groups or conferences are interested in what we would call a dramatic reading, rather than, quote-unquote, giving a talk, and this accompanied by rear screen projections of many, many images, some lingering on the screen for a few moments, others for a few minutes, that it was a way that I thought I might be able to expand the audience of people that normally, if ever, would, look into a UFO, quote-unquote, related story. What I realized was there was an answer, a way, a solution to taking this dramatic reading and making it into a truly theatrical project by doing something that would require here and there a certain amount of extrapolation or creative reasoning that isn't necessarily absolutely the truth, because we don't know the absolute truth here. And that, I would say simply, except that it requires for me a lot more reading and study and a lot more writing, is take this story and put it in the first person and make all of the appropriate changes, adjustments in the narrative and the text so that it would be a one-person, two-act play recounted by James Forrestal himself. And, of course, that immediately sets up the understanding that he is recollecting this after he is gone. And that establishes many wonderful challenges, choices, decisions that a simple narrative reading in the second person does not, as you, as a playwright, well know.
Absolutely. And I mean, the fact that, again, we have only the facts given to us by the people involved with the investigation into his death, into his possible murder or suicide. Therefore, to get the chance to see it through his eyes, through the lens of your research, Peter, I think is extremely refreshing and is what people want, is a good story, first and foremost, unfortunately, at the expense of one incredible American's fate, mortality. But yeah, I do get the sense of a Greek tragedy when we look at this. I'm getting glimpses of Julius Caesar. I'm getting glimpses of Oedipus. Just everything you can possibly think of is in this story. And one of the most intriguing things, as you were going through this, that kept replaying through my mind is the time period and the stakes in which whatever Forrestal knew, how high they were in terms of his knowledge, if we are to intrinsically link this to UFOs. That would be taken with the utmost seriousness. And we look at something now. Look at the current Pentagon story that has been making the rounds. This gentleman, Luis Elizondo, who has brought this information forward with this secret Pentagon program. Now, the guy is talking his face off about this, and we have to wonder, why has there been no stamp put down on what he is bringing forward? And then you look at something like this, over 50 years ago having occurred, and the man was possibly murdered because of the information he knew. Now, how do you believe the times have changed in terms of that, Peter, of the knowledge within these agencies of what people know and what they could possibly leak to the public?
Well, they've changed, to use a word that's just come up, dramatically since then. First, these were simpler times, and the great majority of Americans genuinely loved their country, and even with all of its faults, and God knows there were many, saw it as the greatest place in the world, that patriotism was not lip service, that people genuinely sacrificed, and that the media, well, you could say this also about the early 60s, when we now know that there were major individuals in the media who were fully aware of John Kennedy's peccadillos and dalliances and affairs, who covered for him, where now it's considered fair sport to take a shot at anybody with confirmed or unconfirmed information regarding immoral behavior, absolute incompetence, etc. There was more of a climate of respect. Right now, I think it's fair to say, if every one of your listeners thought of 100 people in their lives, including families, friends, workers, if they've got that many, and most people do, even if you hardly know them, every one of those people has either been in therapy, has a relative who was in therapy, or knows somebody who has been in therapy, for all of the broad meaning that two-word term means to us in our culture. In 1949, you could probably say almost the exact opposite was true. Of any 100 randomly selected people in 1949, nobody knew somebody who was in therapy. Maybe you knew somebody who, seeing a Freudian analyst or something, or had a friend or an acquaintance who knew somebody, but it was such a different world. This is also at that crucial period of those few first short years after World War II that the United States was calcifying its secrets around that original irritating grain of sand in the proverbial historic oyster shell that went on to become the pearl. And remember, a pearl is calcification built up on an object that is irritating the host. And I think Richard Dolan embodied it so perfectly in the first two of his 3-book series, UFOs in the National Security State. The origins of our national security state were not secrets around the A-bomb. It was the UFO subject, although official history does not acknowledge that. That's where it began. And in 1949, for the first time that we are aware of, in the less than 2 years since the modern age of UFO sightings, the tremendous concerns generated that we have read in firsthand accounts and in absolutely authentic, declassified various agency documents, somebody in the highest level of the chain of secrecy breaks. And the break is controlled. He's now institutionalized and no information is going to get in or out. Smart money says that he will get better. But if you're not familiar with the dynamics of breakdown, and again, I can't stress this whole alpha male reality too much. While Forrestal was a scholar, a gentleman, a patriot, very well read, he was also somebody who possessed these major character flaws of personalizing on an extreme level, and as he had done since he was young, his failures and his successes in private life and in his public life. He also seemed to lack the ability to fully confide in anyone. He had friends, certainly, and many people were attracted to the guy. He was absolutely charismatic. That classic idea of he was the man in the room that all the women wanted to sleep with and all the guys wanted to have a drink with or play around a golf with is truer in his case than as true as anybody you've ever heard it applied to. I think you have exhibited great objectivity in citing your comments of the material I've just presented as the possibility of a suicide. For me, I think if I were able to present this information with the paperwork and my sources in the equivalent of a court, I could establish grounds for murder, but only with circumstantial evidence. The circumstantial evidence in enough volume and character has gotten people hung in this world. But yes, can I say definitively? No, I wasn't there. It's just that this is what everything points me toward. And if ultimately this becomes a play, I think it's fair to say that I would write it from the point of view of somebody who appreciated that they had been murdered. Obviously, in that netherworld of fantasy of contemplating, a theater piece based on the memories and impressions and observations of somebody who is now in that very special state we would call dead, would necessitate many people saying, well, I will definitely take this with a grain of salt. Well, any good theater goer. The other thought that came to mind is over the decades, various scripts have come to me, obviously for different treatments on film tellings of the UFO story, and that's where we see the great majority of them over time, and a handful, maybe 7 or 8 treatments over the decades for plays or attempts at plays. There's only one that I've read that I've thought was brilliantly successful, and that is Marty Martin's great play, which is about the summer of 1947 and splits itself back and forth between Washington and Roswell. Marty is a very accomplished and highly respected playwright, a good friend, one of the great men of the theater that I know. And we actually produced that play several times in Roswell with a very fine professional and mixed amateur cast. I would like to see it produced in New York, at least off Broadway. I think it's a fine play. But theater goers and the subject of UFOs, I've never seen them entangle in any meaningful manner. And there's so much wonderful opportunities for telling stories in play form. Again, I could have just as easily said, my epiphany last week was that I should make this into a film script. Mm-hmm. That is a bird of a whole different color. And the fact is, I first published my findings on Forrestal online more than a dozen years ago. They're out there. Somebody could grab the material I researched and other people have researched and bring it into a film treatment. I would like to be part of something like that in future, but this is not the time nor the project.
Right. And I think, again, it's that idea of a character exploration. And the thing I have found most challenging as a playwright and also as a UFO researcher is that entanglement, Peter. It's so hard to bring such a, forget the pun, like an out there topic onto a grounded stage. And the only way to do that, I firmly believe, is to focus on the individual having the experience or being a part of it. And in terms of this, again, if we are to link Forrestal with the UFO topic, is him, first and foremost. This incredible, charismatic, brilliant individual, and what he may have been told, that caused this breakdown and the aftermath of that. Yeah, I think this is a perfect thing for the stage. Could it work on film? Absolutely. Anything can work on film. But I think this is a very interesting way to go. Again, I respect the hell out of Marty Martin. I would love to see he and you work on this together, to be honest. And hey, I could always come in to play one of the custodians at the hospital or something. I haven't given up on acting yet, my man.
No, don't. I guess my overriding concern is I've worked really hard over the years, certainly have fallen on my face and very publicly regarding things that I presented as truthful that I later learned were not. If this story is taken into a theatrical context, people will always be able to say, well, he obviously had to make certain things up or take guesses that may or may not have been true. And, if he's lending his research talents to the theater, I'm going to have to, be a little more circumspect in his other work, because who knows, maybe it'll blow back there and he won't be. Well, obviously, that's not the way I work, but I know the first things I have to do and find the time to do, if this piece moves beyond the form that it's in now, is reread the entire Forrestal Diaries, reread Professor Rogo's book. And equally as important, there is one wonderful, brilliantly researched in-print biography on Forrestal called Driven Patriot that I need to reread in detail. It deals with, of course, nothing remotely related to UFOs, but the authors are superb. Douglas Brinkley, one of America's most respected historians, and I believe a Pulitzer Prize winner, I may be wrong there, his co-author, and talk about serendipitous coincidences and just missing getting that ring. It was written by a man named Townsend Hoops. Hoops, I think, rose to the level of Undersecretary of Air Force, but began at the Pentagon in his 20s working in James Forrestal's office, so actually had contact with him. And then after retiring, taught history at Georgetown. It turned out, and this goes back some years ago, that in discussing my general research on Forrestal with a dear friend, Sandra Wright, gone now, but a wonderful woman who was very close to Lawrence Rockefeller and Marie Galbraith, wife then of our secretary to our ambassador to France and daughter-in-law of the great economist. Sandy had worked with Lawrence and Marie in pulling together and making a reality an extraordinary document called UFOs, the Best Evidence, which was printed in a very limited edition and presented to all members of Congress, world leaders, cabinet-level officials, etc. Anyway, one thing led to another, and she mentioned to me that Hoops had written this book that I had, but didn't make the connection and should have, because it's a very unusual name. And I knew Townsend Hoops in a wonderfully superficial way for some years because he was on the board of the Mirror Repertory Company. And several times a year, in tuxedos at openings, we would make small talk about theater. And I had no idea that he knew or had worked with Forrestal. And right then and there, Sandy called Mr. Hoops and his wife and got her on the phone. And I realized within seconds she was talking to Mrs. Hoops, and that something was very wrong. And indeed it was. Townsend was very far along in dying from the cancer that would kill him shortly after. So I missed that opportunity. But for anybody generally interested in the life of James Forrestal, I can recommend this book without reservation. It's called Driven Patriot: The Life and Times of James Forrestal. It's published by the Naval Institute Press and can be ordered online.
First of all, I can't thank you enough for doing this for us today. Your voice must be strained beyond comprehension at this point. I mean, you sound pretty clear to me still, so kudos to you, my friend. But in terms of that, I think what you are contributing to the installment of works done on James Forrestal is amazing. And I think that this contribution is going to bring to light some extremely interesting revelations, no matter which medium you choose to put this into. But I'm excited, first and foremost, for it to possibly be a play. But I will take it no matter what it is.
Well, thank you, Ryan, for the opportunity for me to be able to hear myself do this in a manner where I can relax in my office, but I'm speaking to any number of people, some genuine friends, all people who listen to your show. I'm looking for feedback on this. Again, it's still a work in progress. I hope that people learn something from it, and in a manner I don't usually put forward after giving a quote-unquote UFO talk, dark and unhappy as this story ends. I hope people enjoy it for what it is.
Peter, where can we send that feedback if possible? Where can listeners contact you?
Oh, really simple. They are welcome to get my email address from you. If we're friends on Facebook, you can always send it as a Facebook message. But right now, they can do it right through you or on Facebook, or whenever I'm on the air, just ask that question.
Perfect. I am honored to be a conduit for that, so I will definitely give that out to my listeners if they so choose to. Peter, an incredible story about an incredible man brought to us by another incredible individual. So again, thank you so much for joining me on Somewhere in the Skies.
You're welcome, and thank you.
Of course, and lights fade to black. That is it for this two-part series on the extraordinary life and strange death of James Forrestal. I have to thank Peter Robbins once again for sharing this incredible story with us. If you'd like to contact Peter personally, head on over to somewhereintheskies.com and use the contact tab. I'll then give you his contact info. Please, if you haven't already, subscribe, rate, and review Somewhere in the Skies on iTunes or wherever you may listen from. It helps us gain new listeners and ask new questions. We're on Twitter @SomewhereSkies and Instagram @SomewhereSkiesPod. I'll see you here next Monday, and remember, keep your feet on the ground, but never stop searching somewhere in the skies.
The Somewhere in the Skies podcast is part of the Lionsgate Sound Network. Please take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever possible. Thank you for listening.